It's interesting, we heard from the minister of DRC. What's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years.
Greetings, good people, and welcome to the channel. Renowned economist and advisor JefferySachs believes that African nations and Africa in overall has been denied rights, has been a victim of an agenda by the Western powers, and especially the US, to keep it shackled, underdeveloped, all these many decades after independence. Not my words, this is the horse speaking. So let's listen in and get a word or two.
We heard from the minister of DRC. What's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba.
Now, that's where the rain began beating Africa. The seeds of plunder were sowed during King Leopold's reign in the Congo. For the 3 decades that he was there, a lot of human life lost, limb lost, and obviously a lot of resources hived off the Congo. That formula has persisted through the decades since independence. And JefferySachs talks about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first prime minister, and the man who was set to have his country on the right path towards development. Perhaps a little too zealous at the time. He did not play safe enough, but nonetheless, he did not deserve what he got. And through the decades, Congo has been mired in this political mess, this economic plunder that seems to have been presided over by the Western powers, and he's specifically talking about the US. Obviously, Belgium was partisan. Belgium was the country that ruled Congo for the longest time, but particularly the most crucial time in the history, when rubber was discovered in Congo, and hence the reign of King Leopold for the 3 decades that he was there, and eventually the discovery of raw materials, minerals, tons of minerals from within the belly of this vast country, the Congo, later on called Zaire by Mobutu Sese Seko, who was effectively used by the US after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Congo may never rest. A good majority of Africa today is now facing the onslaught of China as well. Obviously, China using its soft power and coming without the barrel of the gun, unlike what the others did. In a sense, saying, listen, we'll be able to take this, and give you this back. Whether there's a balance there is a big question that obviously African nations have to resolve. But JefferySachs has definitely hit the nail on the head and is pointing fingers. Let's hear what more he's got to say.
And so we have a system, but we need a different system. We cannot turn this over to the private sector. We already did about 100 years ago. Not only to the private sector with the US military behind it, with the defense of these property rights in the minister of Honduras's country, where United Fruit ran the country for a long time. And their attorney was the foreign minister of the United States, Secretary Dulles, and his brother was the head of the CIA and overthrew the next door neighbor, Mr. Arbenz, to make sure that United Fruit could have its property. So we have a system, but we need a different system. And the different system has to be based on principles of human dignity in the Universal Declaration, principles of sovereignty, principles of economic rights, because these are not nice things to do. In 1948, all the government said that food is a right, social protection is a right, not a nice thing, not a pleasant thing, a right. That was 73 years ago. The SDGs are nothing more than our generation's attempt to honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I come from a country that not only doesn't care about the world's poor, it doesn't even care about its own poor. 1 in 7 Americans is hungry right now. And they don't care. I mean, the poor people care, but one political party, all it cares about is cutting taxes for the rich and filibustering any solution. So we're in a world that's really tough. The private sector's not going to solve this problem. I'm sorry to say to all of the private sector leaders, behave, pay your taxes, follow the rules. That's what you should do. And what the governments should do is the following. They won't, but they should. First, the G20 should become the G21 by inviting systemically the chairperson of the African Union and the African Union to be the 21st country. The European Union is a member of the G20 as the EU. If you add the AU as the 21st for the G21, you add 1.4 billion people to representation at that crucial event. That will change decisively the discussion, because 1.4 billion people are not at the table for finance right now, and they need to be. So my first recommendation is the G21. I love the G20. Add one seat, 1.4 billion people with the AU represented.
And that has been spoken about by a former AU ambassador to the US, Ambassador Chiombori, Arikana Chiombori. The borrowing regime by the Bretton Woods institutions have tended to favor the Western world. The argument being that perhaps Africa is a high-risk factor. But this same high-risk factor is the same continent where the West hives off its raw materials, that builds the same economies, that gives them the power to be able to borrow at near zero costs, while Africa is virtually left to the dogs, economically speaking, that is. So there's a lot of work to be done, absolutely. But Africa has got to play smart to resolve the problem of being played out by the West in terms of negotiating for loans, for opportunities, but also for just getting equity at the table. The G21 that he's referring to, that should include Africa, is long overdue. And remember, even the EU is already on board, and EU just came up the other day. So really, what's the reason to keep Africa locked out? It can only be political. It can only be power play by the super rich nations that obviously want to retain the privileged position in the economic power play. That Africa has got to resist at all cost. It is real work.
Second, we need an order of magnitude change of development finance. The rich countries just borrowed $17 trillion for COVID. The poor countries, nothing. Because the rich countries can borrow at 0, and the poor countries pay 5 or 10% coupon rates or have no access at all. So the world exposed its grotesque inequality this past year and a half. Rich countries didn't say, we tighten our belts, why don't you? My country spent $7 trillion of emergency funding, not 1 penny for anybody else, by the way. $7 trillion, it didn't even cross the imagination of the US Congress to include a few crumbs for the rest of the world. But the poor countries cannot borrow. That's what we should have heard from the World Bank. I didn't hear that from the World Bank. I didn't hear real numbers. Real numbers are in trillions right now because the world economy is 100 trillion a year. But we don't talk about real numbers. But my job, all I know in this world is long division. Divide by 100 trillion and then see whether you're talking about something real or not. So that's the second thing. We need massively to increase the lending and borrowing capacity of poor countries at near 0 interest rates like the rich countries have. Then they could get something done. And then we're going to have national pathways. This is a wonderful idea, but they're going to need financing. And so everything that I've been saying, I know the numbers. That's all I do for 40 years is add up what's missing. You want electricity? It has to be purchased. You want digital access? It has to be purchased. You want safe water irrigation? It has to be purchased. This is what I do for a living, is add up these numbers and then find out that then somebody makes up something and names 1/100th of what's really needed. It's not even hard. By the way, the IMF has done wonderful studies in the last 2 years showing that we have a financing gap of about $400 to $500 billion a year for the basics for the SDGs. They show the gap, but nobody comes up with the number, the solution, which wouldn't be so hard because that's just not a big number. It's 0.5 of 1% of world output. So if we really care, we wouldn't have the G7 saying, we love education, therefore we're going to give $3 billion for education. That's what they said at the summit. But what UNESCO has shown is that you need at least $30 billion a year, minimum. But nobody looks at numbers. They just make up nice check the box. So we need the real numbers of finance to back the national pathways. The final thing is we need the UN as the core and central institution of this world, period. Because this is the only way we're going to have a civilized world, is a strong UN. And it cannot be that the whole UN budget is less than my neighborhood's budget in New York. The UN core budget this year is $3 billion. New York City's budget is $100 billion. And then we say, why don't things work well? Because the rich are hoarding everything. Final point, rather than our 3 billionaires going in space, well, they could go into space and stay there and leave their money behind. That would be one idea. But another idea is we have 2,775 billionaires on the current list. Their combined net worth, 2,700, is $13.1 trillion. Now, I have it on good authority, you don't need more than $1 billion to be comfortable. But they have an excess of $11 trillion over just the $1 billion. So we should be taxing that and having a civilized world. Thank you.
JefferySachs.
Then they could get something done. Africa will have to really work hard to push its own agenda, because clearly to be shackled where Africa is obviously has been a long-term agenda. China managed to get out of that in the late 70s. And interestingly, they did this through the US, who supported the system, and I think these many decades later, China has become a superpower, regrettably, for America. Can they stop it? No. The train left the station. The horses bolted out. So it is fair and square for all. Let's see you at the end of the line. Can Africa join that race? That's a big question. So do you think Africa has been asleep? Do you think the West has had a scheme to actually keep Africa shackled wherever it is? Share your thoughts, suggestions, solutions. But most importantly, for those who are really keen to get Africa to build itself, to work for itself, share your comments and join the tribe of AOB, Africa Our Business. In other words, do subscribe, like, and ring that bell so you do not miss out. We'll see you again at the next video. Do check out the rest of our content. This has been AOB. Salute.